Montana Territory, July 1880, Elijah Boone reined in his horse at the edge of the burned-out homestead, his chest tightening as smoke curled faintly from the blackened fields. The wind carried the sharp scent of scorched pine and old sorrow. He had not meant to come this way, was supposed to ride north to Fort Benton with a shipment of rifles, but something had pulled him off the trail. A turn in the earth, a gut feeling, then he looked up. There she was. A woman in a sun-bleached dress, sitting cross-legged on the roof of a sagging cabin, nursing a baby against her chest. Smoke-streaked cheeks, wind-tangled hair the color of wheat. She looked like she had not moved in days. Her eyes locked on him, wide and steady, not scared, just waiting. The baby shifted in her arms with a soft, tired cry. Elijah slid out of the saddle slowly. "Ma'am," she blinked once, the sun in her eyes, then said clear as day, "He said he would come back, so I waited." Her voice didn't tremble. That shook Elijah more than if she'd cried. He stepped closer, boots crunching over dry grass. "Who said that?" She looked down at the baby, then back out toward the horizon, where the trail had long since dried to dust. "The baby's father. He left in the spring, said he had to go find work in Helena, said he would send word. Said he would come back." Elijah looked around. The cabin had been struck by fire maybe a week ago. The barn was nothing but charred beams, no wagon, no horses, barely standing walls. "Has anyone else come through here?" "No," she said, voice flat. "Just you?" He looked up at her again, the baby now asleep on her chest. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Brielle Talbert," he nodded. "I'm Elijah Boone." She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly started crawling toward the edge of the roof. Elijah stepped forward, arms ready. "Hold him," she whispered, easing the baby down into his arms. Elijah took the child gently, surprised by how light he felt. A boy, maybe 6 months old, with pale lashes and a red mark on his little cheek. Brielle climbed down slowly, using the porch beam and what was left of the railing. When her feet hit the ground, she wobbled. Elijah stepped close. "When's the last time you ate?" She said nothing. He looked down at the baby. "What's his name?" "Zeke," Elijah nodded. "Come on, let's get you both out of here." "I cannot leave." Her voice was sharp now, sudden. "He might come back." Elijah looked her in the eyes. "Brielle, if he was coming back, he would have been here already. This place is gone. You cannot stay." She looked up at the roof, then the cabin behind it, as if trying to hold onto something that had already slipped through her fingers. "I waited." "I know," Elijah said gently, "but waiting does not always bring folks back." She stayed quiet for a long moment, then reached out and touched Zeke's head. Her fingers were trembling. Elijah shifted Zeke in one arm and reached for her hand. "I've got a place about 10 miles east. Still standing, food, water, a roof that does not catch fire. You and the boy can come with me, just for tonight." She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red but dry. "Just tonight. If you want more after that, then we talk about it," he said. She nodded once, then followed him to his horse. Elijah helped her up, then handed Zeke to her. He walked beside the horse the whole way home, one hand steady on the reins, the other brushing the hem of her dress when the wind caught it. It was almost sundown by the time they reached his cabin. Small, weather-worn, and quiet. A split fence. A little corral. A lean-to with a goat and a handful of hens that clucked lazily at the sun. Brielle looked around like she had walked into a different life. Inside, Elijah lit the lantern and set a kettle on the stove. He handed her a clean blanket and pointed to the bed. "You can rest here." "I will take the floor." Brielle said nothing, just held Zeke tighter and sat down on the edge of the bed, bare feet brushing the wooden floor. Elijah made stew with dried venison and beans, and she ate slowly, like someone remembering how to live. Zeke stirred once, then fell back asleep in her arms. After clearing the bowls, Elijah sat near the fire, watching the flames flicker. Brielle watched him too, quiet for a long time. "You think he is dead?" she asked, voice low. Elijah turned his head. "I think if he cared, he would not have left you like that." Brielle looked down at Zeke. "He said he would marry me when he came back. I believed him. Elijah's jaw tightened. Some men are better at promises than keeping them. She looked at him, eyes searching. You ever lost someone? He nodded. My brother died in the war, left a wife and 2 daughters. I helped raise them until they moved east, never married myself. Why not? He shrugged. Never found someone who stayed. Brielle looked at him for a long time. I stayed. Elijah met her eyes. Something in his chest shifted. That night, she slept with Zeke curled against her chest, and Elijah lay awake on the floor, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it meant that a woman had waited on a rooftop for a man who never returned, only for Elijah to be the one who found her. In the morning, he found her in the garden, barefoot in the dew, Zeke in a sling against her chest. She looked up at him and smiled, faint and real. Thank you, she said. For not asking questions I cannot answer yet. Elijah nodded. You do not have to say anything you are not ready to. She looked at the cabin, the fence, the goats. Is there work I can do? There is always work, he said, so she stayed. 1 day, then 2. Then a week, and Elijah realized something he had not felt in years. He did not want her to leave. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, like dust drifting through sunlight. Elijah rose before first light, tending to the stock and checking the fence line, while Brielle moved through the cabin with an ease that hadn't been there when she first arrived. She'd begun to speak in full sentences again, especially in the evenings, her voice steadier than it had been that first day. Zeke, always pressed close to her, had begun to coo at the sound of her humming, a soft tune with no words that Elijah came to expect as surely as sunrise. One morning, as Elijah knelt in the dirt mending a split rail, he heard her footsteps behind him. She carried 2 tin cups, steam curling from each. She held one out. I found your coffee beans, she said. Didn't think you'd mind. He took the cup. Not a bit. She sat down beside him, brushing her skirt beneath her knees. Zeke was asleep in a sling tied snug across her shoulder. The baby's breath rose and fell gently against her chest. I never asked how long you've had this place, she said, eyes scanning the horizon. 7 years, Elijah said. Bought it after driving cattle south for a man out of Miles City. Thought I'd stay a season. Winter came and I didn't feel like leaving. Brielle nodded, sipping slowly. You built all this alone, mostly. Hired help now and then. A neighbor came by last year to raise the new roof on the shed, but he moved closer to town after his wife passed. She traced a crack in her mug with her thumb. You ever think about selling? No reason to. It's quiet, I know the land. It doesn't give more than it has, but it's honest. She looked toward the small garden where beans had started to climb the poles she'd set in herself. Honest sounds nice. Elijah glanced at her. You thinking about staying longer than just tonight? I don't know yet, she said. But I haven't thought about leaving in days. That's something. Elijah didn't press her. He just nodded and returned to the fence, and she sat beside him until the sun crested high enough to wake the flies. Later that week, Elijah saddled his horse to ride into town for salt and flour. Brielle stood in the doorway, Zeke on her hip, a flour-dusted apron tied over her dress. You need anything? He asked. She hesitated. Fabric, if you see it. Doesn't have to be new, just something I can make into shirts for Zeke. He nodded. Anything else? She looked at him, her eyes searching. No. He rode out under a sky thick with heat. When he returned hours later, she was gathering eggs, skirts hitched up to avoid the mud near the coop. She looked up as he dismounted, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. You bring the flour and the fabric, he said, pulling a folded bundle from his saddlebag. It's not much, but it's clean. She took it carefully, thumb brushing the edge. Thank you. He unsaddled the horse while she went inside. By the time he stepped into the cabin, the scent of biscuits filled the air. She moved quickly between stove and table, sleeves rolled up past her elbows. You cook like you've been here longer than a week, he said. I grew up cooking for 5 brothers. You learn to stretch what you've got. He sat at the table, watching her cut into a pan of cornbread. Where were you raised? North of Yankton, she said, setting a slice in front of him. My father ran a small ferry across the Missouri. Not much money, but we had enough. He broke the bread in half, steam rising. You still in touch with your kin? No, she said, her voice lower. Things changed after my mother died. My father married again. She didn't want me. I left when I turned 16. Elijah didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. That was the way with some things better left in the quiet. That night, after Zeke fell asleep, Elijah sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Brielle stepped out, arms folded, shawl wrapped tight. Cool tonight, she said. He nodded. Storm coming, maybe. She leaned against the post, watching the trees sway. Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if things had gone differently? How do you mean, if you'd married, had children, stayed somewhere with more people? He set the blade down. Sometimes. But I figure we're shaped by what we carry. She looked out into the dark. I used to imagine a house near a river. A man who didn't leave before the baby came. Chickens. A dog, not much, just steadiness. He glanced at her. You still want that? I don't know, she said. But when I wake up here, I don't feel hollow. He stood, stretching. The wind had picked up, tugging at the trees. If there's anything you need, you tell me. She met his eyes. I will. The next morning, she was already at the well when Elijah stepped outside, drawing water with her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth torn from the fabric he'd brought. Zeke sat nearby in a basket lined with blankets, gumming a wooden spoon. I was thinking, she said, pouring water into a basin. If you let me plant squash before the next rain, we might have a harvest by September. Elijah leaned against the post, arms crossed. You don't need to ask. If you see something needs doing, do it. She looked up at him and smiled, not polite, not guarded, just sure. All right, she said. I will. By late August, the land had softened under the weight of rain. Squash vines stretched thick along the garden Rose Brielle had planted, and the hens had taken to nesting under the porch, out of reach of the fox Elijah had glimpsed near the creek. The days passed quiet but full, the kind of full that didn't need announcing. Elijah had begun building a small addition off the back of the cabin, a space for Zeke once he grew past the cradle. He didn't ask Brielle if she planned to stay that long. He just started cutting the boards. One evening, she was stitching near the fire while Zeke lay sleeping in the corner, his breath even and soft. Elijah sat across from her, oiling his saddle straps. The silence between them had grown comfortable, no longer something to fill. You know what I miss? She asked, knotting her thread. He looked up. What's that? Books, she said. Not Bibles or ledgers, just something with a story. My oldest brother used to bring home dime novels from the post. I'd read them under the covers until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Elijah leaned back in his chair. I've got a few in the trunk under my bed, nothing fancy. Couple of journals, an almanac, and a copy of the Prairie Traveler that someone left behind. She raised a brow. The one by Randolph Marcy. That's the one. I read that cover to cover once, back when I thought I'd head west alone. She smiled faintly. I never made it farther than Fort Shaw. Elijah stood, crossed to the bed, and dragged out the trunk. He handed her the worn copy. She ran her fingers across the cover like it was something rare. You can read it again if you want, he said. I will, she said. Thank you. The next morning, Elijah saddled the mule cart for a trip to the mill. Brielle came out carrying Zeke, wrapped in a shawl against the early chill. I'll ride with you, she said. You don't have to. I want to. They rode in silence for a while, the wheels creaking over the rutted road. Zeke dozed in her lap. The trees thinned as they approached the open stretch near the river. I've been thinking, she said, watching the pale blue of the sky. About winter. He kept his eyes ahead. What about it? I could take in mending, maybe even some sewing for the women in town, if folks would trust me. They will, he said. She glanced at him. You sure? You've got steady hands. That counts more than a last name around here. She didn't answer right away. Then, I never told you what happened to my folks' name. Talbert wasn't mine to start. He waited. My real name was Brielle Mason. I changed it when I left. Made it easier to disappear. He didn't turn to look at her. You don't have to explain. I know, but I want to. The cart bumped over a washout. Zeke stirred and settled again. My father drank, she said, voice low. After my mother died, it got worse. When he remarried, his new wife didn't want a girl in the house. Said I was too much trouble. One night, I packed a bag and walked until my feet bled. Elijah said nothing for a long time. You ever think about going back? He asked. No, she said. There's nothing left to go back to. By the time they returned from the mill, wind had picked up, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. Elijah helped unload the sacks while Brielle took Zeke inside. That night, he found her standing by the open door, watching the sky. You all right? He asked. She turned. I've been wondering something. Go on. If I do stay, she said, what would you want from me? Elijah stepped closer, slow. Nothing you don't already give. She watched him carefully. And if I gave more, he didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, I'd hold it like it was worth something. Wind tugged at her shawl. She reached up, touched the stubble along his jaw, then let her hand fall. I'm not the same girl who waited on a roof, she said. I know. He closed the space between them, not fast, not bold, just sure. When he kissed her, it wasn't a question. It was a promise. Inside, Zeke stirred, then settled again. The fire cracked low. Elijah rested his forehead against hers. You don't have to wait anymore, he said. I know, she whispered. I'm already here. By mid-September, the air carried the edge of frost at first light, silvering the grass and turning the morning still. Elk had started moving lower in the hills, and Elijah left out early with his rifle, hoping to get meat stored before the first snow. He returned before dusk with 2 rabbits instead, not what he'd hoped for, but enough to keep them fed a while longer. Brielle met him at the door, her hands red from scrubbing linens. Zeke was in the cradle, chewing on the corner of a cloth book she'd stitched from scraps. Elijah handed her the rabbits by the hind legs. I'll clean them out back, she said, already heading for the basin. Elijah watched her go, her braid falling over one shoulder, her gait steady as ever. She no longer moved like someone waiting for something to end. That night, after Zeke had gone down and the fire had burned low, Brielle pulled a small tin from beneath the bed. She opened it carefully, then held out its contents, 2 silver rings, dulled and scratched, but whole. Elijah, she said, sliding one onto her thumb. These were my mother's. She wore them until her hands swelled too much to keep them on. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You've carried them all this time. I kept them in the hem of my skirt, sewn in tight. I almost forgot they were there till I washed it last week. He took the other ring, turning it in his fingers. You want to wear them again? I want them to mean something again. He looked at her, then down at the ring. They can. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. I'm not asking for promises, just place. A name that isn't borrowed, a home that's mine because I built it, not because someone left it behind. He closed his fingers around hers. I can give you that. You already have, she said. They married beneath a cottonwood before frost touched the branches. Elijah asked the neighbor from downriver to speak the words, and Brielle wore a dress she'd let down at the hem with a strip of blue checked calico. Zeke sat in Elijah's arms during the vows, tugging at the buttons on his shirt. Afterward, they ate bread and roasted squash, and Brielle laughed when the baby smeared his face with honey. Elijah didn't try to say anything grand. He just watched her, memorizing the way she looked with wind in her hair and dirt on her hands and a quiet kind of joy in her smile. Later, when the lantern burned low and Zeke had gone to sleep, she took Elijah's hand and pulled him toward the bed she had once only planned to borrow for a night. She touched his chest, where the buttons had come loose, and he touched her cheek, where the wind had left a faint flush. There were no declarations, just breathe and the weight of belonging, and the sense that they had already begun something long before this night. In the weeks that followed, the weather turned sharp. Snow came early that year, wet and heavy. Elijah built a second cradle one Zeke wouldn't outgrow before spring, and Brielle mended every blanket in the house. She started saving extra flour for the women in town who'd offered to trade for her stitching. Word had spread after she'd patched a preacher's coat so cleanly you couldn't find the tear one morning. As Elijah came in with a pail of snow to melt, he found her sitting with a scrap of cloth stretched over a hoop, brow furrowed with concentration. "You making something new?" she nodded without looking up. "A quilt for the baby we haven't spoken about yet." He paused, snow melting down his sleeves. "You're sure?" "I'm late," she said, "and I know my body." He crossed the room, knelt beside her, took her hand. "If it's a girl," he said, "she'll have her mother's hands. And if it's a boy, he'll learn what it means to stay." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the fire burned low and the wind picked up outside. The baby stirred in the cradle, then settled again. And outside, the land slept beneath snow, quiet and patient, waiting for spring. The first thaw came later than expected. Ice held to the riverbanks well into March, and the snow in the valley melted slow and stubborn, turning the path to the barn into a ribbon of thick brown slurry. Elijah laid planks across the worst of it so Brielle wouldn't slip when she carried Zeke out to feel the sun. The boy had grown heavier over winter, his hair curling at the back of his neck, his legs strong enough to kick the blanket off each night. Brielle had begun to hum again, not the same tune as before, but something new, slower and deeper, like it came from her bones. One morning, she stood at the table tracing patterns on a length of muslin, a paperweight holding down the curling edge. Elijah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her measure the fabric with the side of her hand. "You planning something I should know about?" "Curtains," she said without looking up, "for the windows in the back room. It's time Zeke had shade in the morning." Elijah nodded. "You think we'll need more space when the baby comes?" She paused, then looked toward the wall he'd built up that winter, the cradle already in place beneath the east-facing window. "No," she said, "we'll fit. We just have to be clever about it." He stepped in, touched the small of her back. "You always were." She leaned into his hand for a moment, then pulled a scrap of chalk from the table edge. "I want to teach him to read when he's older. Zeke. Him and the next one, I want them to know how to ask questions, not just follow orders." Elijah smiled, slow. "You thinking about schooling them yourself?" "If I can. There's no formal teacher in the valley anymore, and the last one barely stayed a season." He picked up a length of thread from the table. "You'd be good at it." "I want them to know more than I was allowed to," she said. "Not just letters, the shape of things, the way the world works under the surface." That evening they sat near the hearth, the baby asleep in his basket, the flames low and steady. "I had a letter come from the man I sold pelts to last fall," Elijah said, folding the paper back into its envelope. "He's offering to buy more and says he can bring a traveling merchant out this way come summer, thinking we could stock up then, if you've got anything to trade." Brielle nodded. "I've got some stitching ready, and I can make soap if we put away enough lard." He met her eyes. "You still thinking of staying through next winter?" She didn't answer right away. She reached down to adjust the shawl around her shoulders, then looked up. "I'm not thinking about leaving anymore." Elijah watched her for a long moment. "I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything." "I don't," she said. "That's what makes it real." Later that night, the wind picked up, knocking a loose shutter against the wall. Elijah stepped outside to fix it. Brielle followed, arms wrapped around her belly, the cold air catching at her hem. The stars were spread thick above them, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. "I never thought I'd be here," she said. "Not just in Montana, in this life. With someone who listens." Elijah set the shutter right, then took her hand. "I don't always know what to say." "You don't need to," she said, brushing her thumb against his. "You stay." That's the answer. In May, The baby came another boy, red-faced and wailing, born just before dawn with the birds barely stirring outside. Brielle gritted her teeth and pushed through the long labor with Elijah at her side, soaking cloths and whispering the few words he could find. When the child was placed in her arms, she didn't cry. She just held him close, pressed her lips to his damp hair, and whispered his name, Caleb. Elijah carried Zeke in to meet his brother, the toddler wide-eyed and solemn as he touched the baby's foot with one careful finger. In the weeks that followed, the cabin grew louder, Caleb's cries drifting through the night, Zeke learning to string together words and demand spoons instead of fingers. Brielle moved slower now, but her hands stayed busy. She stitched while nursing, hummed while boiling wash water, laughed when Elijah came in with his boots caked in field mud and muttered curses under his breath. One evening, she sat on the porch with Caleb in her arms and Zeke at her feet, stringing beans onto a length of twine for him to play with. Elijah came up from the field, dirt under his fingernails and a cut across one knuckle. She looked up. "That fence hold. Better than I thought," he said. "I'll put a fresh post in tomorrow." She stood and walked toward him, Caleb tucked against her shoulder. "You always look tired this time of day." He took the baby from her arms and kissed her temple. "Maybe. But I don't regret a minute of it." She leaned her forehead against his chest, breathing in the scent of sun and sweat and dry grass. "That's the first time you've said it aloud." He tilted her chin up. "I meant it long before I said it." She smiled, slow and certain. "Then say it again." "I don't regret a minute of it," he whispered, brushing her hair back. They stood like that until Zeke toddled over and tugged at Elijah's trouser leg, demanding to be held too. Elijah lifted him with his free arm, laughter in his chest. That summer, they built a table long enough for more than just the four of them. Neighbors began to come by again for cloth, for eggs, for the warmth of company. Brielle taught Zeke letters with a slate board and a stub of chalk. Elijah carved a cradle from pine for the next child they hadn't yet spoken of but had both begun to imagine. And when the first frost came again, they didn't brace against it. They lit the fire, closed the shutters, and held their children close, because they'd come through the dark already. And this was the morning after.